Right, so we are up to 50 participants. I think that's a good point to start things formally. Welcome, everyone. My name's James Wilsdon. I'm Director of RoRI, the Research on Research Institute, and it's great to welcome you all here for this event, the launch of the 10th project in the second phase of RoRI, the AFIRE Accelerator for Innovation, Research Funding, Experimentation, which you're going to hear a lot more about shortly from various colleagues. Many of you, oh, we've got echo here in the room. Sorry, many of you who've joined are from the funders and partners who work with RoRI in various capacities, different projects, and in our core group of partners. There are others, of course, who've also joined today who aren't involved. So welcome, particularly to you. Let me just say a word or two about sort of what lies behind this, and I say you'll hear more from others as we go through the course of the agenda. But RoRI was set up in 2019, initially by the Wellcome Trust and a group of other partners, funders particularly, to try and accelerate transformative change in research systems, cultures, and decision making. And as we began work with particularly that group of funders who were at the vanguard of these meta-scientific debates, the importance and opportunity of doing more experiments with the funding evaluation system was one of the sort of highest priorities on all of our shared agendas. So in the pilot phase of RoRI, we did quite a lot of work on that agenda in various ways. A lot of the pilot phase of RoRI was during the pandemic, so it was harder than we perhaps hoped when we started out to do larger, more ambitious multi-funder experiments. But we did a lot of work nonetheless to try and bring together, synthesize evidence and examples of work that was going on in a variety of our own partners and elsewhere. And many of you, I think, will have seen the product of a lot of that work, which was the Experimental Research Funders Handbook, which came out in 2022, and was an attempt to try and draw some of that together and present it in a form that could be used by colleagues, particularly in funding organizations, trying to persuade others, the sort of thing you could give to the board or to senior stakeholders to persuade them of the merit of this kind of activity. But of course, the field has continued to expand, diversify. There's a lot going on, and we're going to hear some examples of several of the latest experiments that have been initiated in the past few months by some of the funders amongst us. And then in the second half of today, we're going to talk much more collaboratively, I hope, about the things that we could do together and the way in which we can make the ambition behind this accelerator something that's concrete, practical, useful to all of you. So thank you again for joining us. We are going to run through the agenda. As you've seen, I'm going to hand over in a second to my colleague, Tom Stafford, Tom is a professor at Sheffield, a psychologist by background, but these days as much a meta-scientist as anything else. And Tom is part of the core group leading AFIRE. He'll talk us through the basics. Just a word about process. We're running today's meeting under the Chatham House rule, particularly the second half, when we'll hopefully be talking together about experiments that we're thinking about doing, planning to do, would like to do together or on our own account. We will record this first part of the meeting for the keynote presentations, which we do intend to use later in various contexts, but we'll then turn the recording off, and the rest will be private for us as a group. And we think it's important in a debate like this, where we're very conscious of the need to create a sort of safe environment in which funders can share peer-to-peer what they're planning, what they're thinking about, some of the dilemmas that they're grappling with respect to this kind of activity. We think it's important to run the meeting along those lines. So with that, I will hand over, I think, to Tom, who is going to give us a quick intro to AFIRE, and then we'll get into the other presentations. Tom.
Thank you for that, James. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have so many people here from so many funders, so many different kinds of funders, so many different parts of the world. AFIRE, as James has briefly alluded to, was set up to accelerate funder experimentation. You can, at the bottom of the agenda, you can read a bit about our purposes. We want to raise awareness of evidence generation via experiments. We want to motivate and inspire experiments and help bring together funders to ideally collaborate on experiments to support enhanced capacity for planning, running, and using evidence from experiments on interventions in the funding system, better funding, more efficient funding, fairer funding. So we want to support a kind of culture of experimentation through this kind of peer review model, where we hopefully we hear from each other and do things together. So yeah, and part of that is we recognise that there are lots of the different funders are in different positions on this kind of journey to becoming experimental, and we're really excited to hear from some sort of veterans of experimental evaluation in the first part, and then in the second part of the meeting we'll be discussing in breakout groups and then in a final plenary ways which we can support more experiments, better experiments, and use of experimental evidence. Hopefully you have all heard from me with a copy of the agenda. I will be circulating that along with links for how to follow up on specific information shared in this meeting, or how to get in touch if you want to become more engaged with AFIRE in the future. If there is anything, do feel free to email me at t.stafford@sheffield.ac.uk, either during the meeting or afterwards. And I think we will now pass over to James, who will be introducing our 3 keynote speakers in the first part of the meeting.
Great, thank you, Tom. So we thought we would kick off by hearing from 3 big players in the space, or sort of 3 exciting initiatives. We're going to hear first from the UK, which wasn't doing a great deal. I have to say, when RoRI launched in 2019, there wasn't a huge amount going on in the UK funding system in this regard. And I'm pleased to say that that has changed quite radically in recent times. And we're going to hear about that in a moment from Stian Westlake, who's the executive chair of the Economic and Social Research Council, one of the councils under UK Research and Innovation, the integrated funder that we have here. He'll be talking about a new funding scheme that the UK system has launched, which has been initiated in parallel with the creation of what I think is the world's first in-house government Metascience unit that has been launched within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology in the British government. So Stian's going to talk all about that. We're then going to move to Germany and hear from Hanna Denecke from the Volkswagen Foundation. Volkswagen Foundation were very much at the forefront of this, and were, certainly when we launched RoRI, one of the most active funders in doing these kind of experiments. They had their experiment initiative that I'm sure Hanna will refer to, that ran for 5-6 years, but they continued to do various interesting initiatives and further experiments in this regard. And then finally, we're going to hear in this first section from Caleb Watney, who is the co-founder CEO of the Institute for Progress over in the States, and the IFP are working with the National Science Foundation, big part of the US federal funding system, to undertake a series of experiments within the NSF's funding portfolio. So given the size and scale of the US federal R&D system, that is always a source of great interest to all of us around the world as we look to see what kind of insights and findings emerge from that kind of activity. Yeah, should be a good tour through some of the newer things that are going on, and then of course we'll play into hearing from many of you about other experiments that you're engaged in already, that you're planning, that you would like to do. But if he is now online and ready, let me invite Stian. Hi, Stian. Good to see you.
I'm here. Sorry about that. You lost me for a second. Our Wi-Fi, for some reason, in this building broke down, so you got me on my phone. Apologise to everyone. That will mean that you don't have slides, but I'm sure perhaps people will be grateful for a break from PowerPoint for a while. I wanted to talk about the work that we are doing here in the UK, and particularly at UK Research and Innovation, the UK's main national funder for R&D, on Metascience broadly. It's something that I, as Executive Chair of the Economic and Research Council, part of UKRI, lead on behalf of UKRI. And we've got some new things underway that we're very excited about, I wanted to talk about. But I thought it might be helpful, first of all, especially for those who aren't immersed in the UK scene, just to take a little step back and talk about kind of how the landscape when it comes to Metascience has really been changing in the UK over the last decade or so. And I guess I say this in the context of the UK, like many places, being a country with, in some ways, a very long and estimable meta-scientific tradition. Certainly, I think of places like the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research at the University of Manchester, and other institutions being places that have for decades really thought quite rigorously about, and in an interdisciplinary way, about how research and innovation works, how to make it more impactful, and really in a way that tries to bring together a whole range of disciplines, from STS through innovation economics, through to other interdisciplinary approaches. So in one sense, there is a lot to build on. In another sense, this is something that I think has really risen up the attention in science policy in the UK relatively recently. And it goes without saying that RoRI and the work that colleagues are doing there has been a really big part of that. If I were to characterise UK R&D policy over the last kind of decade plus, it wasn't that long ago that R&D policy felt like a bit of an afterthought in the UK. Government liked to talk about science and technology in a kind of rather warm words way, but there wasn't much of a focus on this being an investment priority, or a lot of interest in how it was done at a top level in government. This was a kind of, it was a second-tier issue, perhaps to be kind, third-tier issue maybe. And I think that has kind of been gradually changing over the last decade in quite a good way. Somewhat surprisingly, immediately after the Brexit referendum and the change of government that occurred then, there was a big push to make significant increases in public investment in R&D. So there was a big focus on quantity of investment, in how R&D could tie into the idea of industrial strategy or industrial policy, which kind of got us thinking about the how as well. Then when there was another change of government, we had a lot of those recently in the UK, when we had another change of government in 2019 and Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, there was then a kind of renewed focus on the quality as well as the quantity of R&D. That was when ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, a kind of ARPA emulator, was set up. And there's just a kind of increasing focus on things that have obviously been big themes in the research world for a long time, but very rarely percolated to the top levels of government, like reducing bureaucracy, research integrity, reproducibility, and some of those kind of important themes. And we have been trying at UKRI to take the lead on it. And specifically, the intervention that we've been working on is a joint UKRI UK government Metascience unit and work to do with that. So this builds on some work that we've been doing in UKRI. We've been big supporters of research integrity, of reproducibility, and of specific studies. So not long ago, we published our review of peer review, which is a meta-analysis of the literature on what we knew about project peer review, which we find very useful, and I hope will be useful to other funding agencies in terms of knowing what works. And I know a lot of the experiments that were written up there were experiments that people on this call's organizations have been involved in, so thank you. And into that emerged the Metascience unit itself. It was a response to a review that was undertaken by Paul Nurse, the UK scientist, about the research landscape in the UK. It recommended a Metascience unit, which was established with £10 million initially of government funding. Now, what that's gone to do is, first of all, to set up a small team, some UKRI staff, some government staff, to provide a bit of a standing capability. And at the end of April, so a couple of weeks ago, we released our first call. The call, which is available online, I will share the link later. It would have been on screen had I had my slides. It's for our first Metascience research grants call. It's a total call of £5 million, funded by DSIT, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology in the UK, by us and by colleagues at Open Philanthropy who have partnered with us on that. Total volume of the call is £5 million sterling. We're looking to make maximum award sizes up to £300,000 for grants looking at really meta-science in quite a broad sense. We're certainly interested in experimental work. We're interested both in kind of looking at important micro questions to do with how research and innovation is funded, but also for work on macro questions as well. And one thing that's been so rewarding about this project so far, it has been seeing the different communities this has brought to bear. And I think, this really bears out some of the really interesting mapping work that RoRI has done, looking at what we might call the meta-science community, because in some ways it's not a community yet. There are some people who identify as meta-scientists, but there are lots of people doing what I think we'd all recognise as really good meta-scientific work who maybe don't yet know they're meta-scientists. So that's something that we are trying to do here, and the work that RoRI is doing that I think is spot on. So this call was issued at the end of April, closes on the 16th of July. We are looking to do more in this area. And I think one of the really things I'm excited about is the existence of this unit really gives us the opportunity to set an experimental agenda when it comes to our work as UKRI. We're a funder, we dispense about £8 billion a year of research and development funding. I'm not saying we're going to stick that all into experiments, but there is an opportunity to conduct some really valuable experiments in that. And this Metascience research grant unit gives us a way of understanding those, of being somewhat rigorous about what we do, and as anyone who works for a public organisation will know, of funding it in a way that's programmatic rather than that becomes an internal cost, which is very useful for all sorts of other reasons, and at the same time helps us build a community rather than just an internal set of expertise. So the unit is being led by my colleague, Jen Gold, Director of Research from ESRC, who is on this call, and Ben Stein from DSIT, who's also on this call. Really great team. It's scaling up at the moment, and we are very excited to see what emerges from it. We're very open to international partnerships as well, because this feels to me like an area where there is a great commonality of challenges. We know from the peer review that we did that the big opportunity here is learning from experiments around the world. There's a lot of general lessons, so we are keen to do that more. We have an international scientific advisory group from the on the unit, which is helping us. But we're keen to make more links. We're keen to work with other funders, and we're keen to see if there's ways of structuring new joint projects. So, with that is more or less all I have to say. To me, this is an area that we want to grow. We want to do more as UKRI. And for us, it's strategically important to our vision of UKRI as an intelligent, a forward-thinking, a progressive funder of research. Really glad to be on this call and in this group and to try and identify new partnerships and new ways to work. I will leave it there, but very happy to answer questions and take further feedback.
On UK matters, before we do move on, I put in the chat as well. We've just announced, 90 minutes ago, in fact, that the UK, London and UCL, my own institution, will be the hosts for the 2025 Metascience meeting. This is the biennial series of meetings that began in 2019 at Stafford and have carried on and have become quite quickly a really important meeting ground for the many different flavours and strands of Metascience, as Stian described them earlier. So we're really excited to be holding it in London. It's the first time it's been outside the States, and hoping to bring in a bigger crowd than ever, obviously bringing in a lot of people from across Europe, and use it also as a chance to showcase more of this kind of work, particularly from the funder community as well as from the academic side. So there's a bit about it on our website, but more on that will come out very soon. Let us move on to our next speaker. As I say, we're going to hear next from Hanna Denecke from VolkswagenStiftung, the Volkswagen Foundation in Hanover, long-term partner to RoRI, and we do a lot of work with the Volkswagen Foundation. Hanna is head of the team for exploration and funding in the funding department at the foundation, and has been involved in these debates for quite some years. So, Hanna, great to see you, and over to you.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yeah, I've been working for the foundation for 8-9 years by now. Started as a program director and now heading the team exploration at the funding department. And let me first say that the Volkswagen Foundation is not a corporate foundation, although the name might suggest otherwise for people here who are not familiar with us. We are not affiliated to the Volkswagen automobile manufacturer. The name is comes basically from the history of the foundation and the funding of the foundation, so the basis. The Volkswagen Foundation is actually Germany's largest private non-profit organization supporting academic research, and we are spending around 100 million euro a year in Germany, but also worldwide. And all our decisions are based on external review, which obviously means that we are putting a lot of work in getting reviewers, finding for reviewers, and also convincing them to support our work. And for some years now, we have been thinking about and experimenting with different review processes at the foundation. James already mentioned that within the funding program experiment, we used lottery, partial randomization. I'm not talking about that today, but I think that is also featured in the book that James showed at the beginning. So I would like to talk today about a very specific experiment we are doing at the moment. So it's really work in progress, supported by Tom Stafford and Stephen Pinfield, who are also here on the call. And we are really in the middle of this process. And we are experimenting with distributed peer review in one of our calls. So and now the slides do not move. Let me see. Now. So I'm not sure whether you have heard of distributed peer review. The idea is basically that applicants agree when they submit a proposal that they review other applications submitted for the same funding program. Volkswagen Foundation is not the first to think about this. This has been used and implemented before. I guess, as far as I'm informed, in astronomy and at different telescopes worldwide, this has been used to allocate telescope time, especially for shorter time slots. But there are also examples from the Netherlands Research Council, where distributed peer review has been used for XS programs. I've seen that some colleagues from NWO are here also in this call, and we had a great talk with the colleagues who implemented this process, and it was quite informative. We also talked to colleagues from ESO about their experience. And basically what ESO did in early 2019 was one of the inspirations for Volkswagen Foundation to also experiment with this distributed peer review. Because at ESO, they also tried out distributed peer review as an experiment. A bit in a different format than we are doing it, but also the idea to have to run the distributed peer review in parallel to the regular panel review. And the idea behind distributed peer review is actually that you have a larger pool of reviewers, obviously, because all the applicants are also asked to review proposals, which also means that you can have more reviewers allocated to each of the proposals than at least for us previously. What is also a big potential from our view is that applicants can receive more and probably more diverse feedback compared to a regular panel process. We also hope, but it's not clear yet, that distributed peer review could make the whole process around peer review a bit more faster and more efficient. It's probably not new for you that it's quite burdensome to find reviewers, to allocate them to proposals and so on. So it's quite a lot of work, and at least for us, it's getting even more difficult to find reviewers and to convince reviewers to support us. So that is one idea where we hope that distributed peer review can help. And then in some, we of course also hope that it makes applicant satisfaction, or it increases applicant satisfaction. With each review process, there are of course reservations also associated or expected, I would say, regarding distributed peer review. And one typical argument against this kind of review process is that those people that are reviewing the applications do not have enough expertise or are biased somehow. That is obviously not only for distributed peer review, but also for other peer review processes. But that is something we would also want to look at during the experiment. Gaming the system is one typical question that we are asked as well, so that people strategically evaluate proposals less, so that they increase the chance of their own proposal to get funding. Theft of ideas is also not limited to distributed peer review, but could be a large reservation against this process because so many more people might see your application. And then, of course, one argument is that this makes that puts more burden on the applicant. So they have their application to write, and then they also have to review up to N proposals. Nevertheless, why should we think about experimenting with these kind of review processes? So, as I said in the beginning, obviously the amount of reviewers is somehow limited. It gets more difficult to find reviewers, and this could be a way to make the whole process more efficient. I also said that the foundation has a bit of a history in experimenting with different review processes. We tried it with the lottery previously, as I said, and we are always looking for new ways of review processes and ways of experimenting with new ideas. And this, somehow crossed our way, and we found it quite interesting and quite promising, and with a lot of potential also for our funding processes. We are currently experimenting with this process in a funding call that is called Open Up, which is focusing on humanities and cultural studies. It's for cooperation projects up to 3 partners, focusing on Germany, but also worldwide. So the main applicant always has to come from Germany. And Open Up used to be a call where we received a lot of applications, so between 150 to 200, which means that we have to do an internal pre-selection because we cannot give all the applications to external reviewers. It's just too much. And we usually have around 8 to 10 reviewers for this kind of call. And then if you just have too many applications, you cannot give all the applications to the review panel. Then also for Open Up, as I said, we have 8 to 10 people in the panel, and there also the expertise is incomplete. So there are always proposals where we do not have 100% fitting expertise in the panel. One of the major criticisms we receive is that we can basically give no feedback to applicants at the moment. Because of the internal pre-selection, of course, we can say a few words, but then there's no lengthy or long or informative written feedback that we can give to applicants. Especially for more junior researchers, this is quite difficult. And that is something that we have received as feedback so far, that this is not very good. What is good about Open Up is that also in the last rounds, it is an anonymous double-blind review process. So which makes the concern regarding bias a little bit less severe, I would say. Okay, so now let me come to the experiment. We decided, and it's probably a good thing that we are a private foundation. We also convinced the board to provide us double funding, basically, so that we can run the panel review process and the DPR in parallel, which obviously allows us to compare these 2 review processes, and especially look at the potential and advantages that I talked about earlier, and see whether we can somehow get to the root of these reservations that people might have. And since for the Volkswagen Foundation has been associated with RoRI and working with RoRI for a long time, it was quite clear for us that we should ask experts to support us on our way in doing this experiment. And we are quite happy that we have Tom and Stephen on our side who have supported us from the beginning. So I said we are still in the middle of the process. So deadline was in April. We have the proposals now here at the foundation, screening them and looking for formal fitting to the call. And the next steps then will be to actually do the matching between applicants and proposals. I think one advantage of Open Up and the call is that this is, I would say, maybe also a small grant program. We only receive short proposals, 3 to 4 pages, so it's a quick review. I would also say we try to make it as easy for the applicants and reviewers to go through the proposals. We also established an technical or digital interface where they can then submit their evaluations. And it's really based on very standardized questions and evaluation forms. We also try to be as transparent as possible and have detailed documentation, had online consultation hours. But honestly, most of the people who joined the consultation hours were more interested in the call than in the DPR. So that might be more interesting for funders than for the people who actually apply. I wanted to talk a bit about preliminary data and show you some of the data we already received. So when we started this process, we discussed with Tom and Stephen what actually would be interesting for us to look at. What could we actually also measure when doing this experiment? And we decided to ask a few questions already at the beginning. So at the stage or at the time when proposals come in. And then we will also have some questions when the reviews come in, so the evaluation sheets. And we are also planning to have some interviews once the decisions are communicated. So that will be early next year. What we would like to find out more about is whether, for example, the evaluation is faster, maybe more robust. So the matching between reviewers and proposals. We want to learn more about whether applicants actually perceive this as acceptable as a review process that might actually deliver better results, whatever that means, compared to the panel review. Yeah, feedback, of course, review quality, whether this is improved. Of course, most of the people here at the foundations are most interested in whether the same proposals are selected from the panel review and the distributed peer review. And actually, I have no clear idea whether that might be the case or not. So that's going to be interesting. Just a few data. So we received 143 proposals, and this includes almost 330 applicants. So it's main applicants and co-applicants that we will allocate now to the proposals. I said earlier, the call is focused on humanities and cultural studies, but there are also some interdisciplinary proposals involved. That's why you see some life science and natural sciences in it. So the next big step will be to match these proposals to the applicants. And then just a few questions that we already asked at the time of the proposal to find out a bit more about the acceptance maybe of DPR. And you see here from the data that the acceptance is actually quite positive. So the process is suitable to review my proposal. A high number agrees to this statement. Also, this process will identify appropriate reviewers, also finds a lot of support, which is, I find it quite reassuring and a good sign. Also, my proposal will receive a fair evaluation under this process, is quite positively evaluated, I would say. And also the trust in the process is quite positive. This picture here is a bit different. So whether the process selects more adventurous proposals than conventional panel review, that's also something we are quite interested in, because Open Up is actually a funding program that tries to go against the mainstream and support innovative, explorative funding. And yeah, I expect the process to select a similar set of proposals to panel review. That's also one of my main interests, actually, to see what comes out, especially regarding the internal pre-selection that we have. So what's next? As said already, that we are now matching reviewers to proposals. In July, we are about to send out the proposals to all the reviewers and receive, hopefully, all the assessments in August. Then in September will be the panel meeting, at which we will also then reveal basically the results from the DPR. Decisions are always made here at the foundation by the Board of Trustees. This will be in November. And then we are about to send out feedback to the applicants in December. And then Tom and Stephen step in again for interview and qualitative analysis. And then probably I can say a lot more, and Tom and Stephen can say a lot more about how efficient the DPR is compared to the panel review.
Let's move to our third keynote speaker. As I said earlier, it's going to be Caleb Watney, who is the co-founder, co-CEO of the Institute for Progress, leads the Metascience team over there, and is centrally involved with others in the new wave of experimentation that is unleashed or on its way across the National Science Foundation. Very exciting. Caleb, over to you.
Hey everyone, great to join you. I will try to cover this pretty quickly, so let's jump in and then we can have time for some questions at the end. I guess I just want to say, overall, I just wanted to take a step back and kind of preview a couple of different efforts that are happening within the larger US Metascience context, and why that might be happening now, and then I'll specifically zoom in on this NSF partnership that a couple of folks have mentioned. So first, I guess a bit about me and about my organization, the Institute for Progress. We're a relatively new think tank, just started a couple of years ago. Focused just on innovation policy, and in particular, trying to focus on areas where we can pull the rope sideways, as one coinage has said. The idea basically being, if you want to have impact in the world, one way of doing that is to sort of look at the giant partisan tug of war match and decide, oh, I want to be on that side, and start pulling. But if you do that, you're one of thousands, if not millions, of other people that are already pulling in that direction, so your marginal impact on that rope is very small. Alternatively, you can look for issues where you can pull the rope sideways. It's not a heavily polarized issue, and there's not sort of an incumbent established interest on the other side. And oftentimes, if you focus in and prioritize those issues, I think it's possible to have much bigger impact. So we work on issues like metascience, STEM immigration, construction, energy productivity, new pandemic prevention technology, and public sector investments in AI. And we're currently about 16 people. As I alluded to, I think we're in kind of a unique moment right now for metascience. I think there's a lot of growing interest. This is not, of course, like a new idea. The idea of science and in general experimentation has been around for a long time, but I think there's sort of renewed public energy and attention, and maybe in particular, new infrastructure that's popping up to kind of like make all this much more viable. I think part of this has been driven by the COVID-19 crisis. I think simultaneously, the world kind of realized the enormous potential of science in delivering mRNA vaccines and kind of wondering, could we have had these faster? On the other hand, there were a lot of concerns that, NIH-funded researchers were really struggling to get money kind of reappropriated for the specific COVID kind of funded research they wanted to do, and you ended up having to have sort of philanthropic stopgap efforts like fast grants, which was able to get money out the door much, much faster. And so I think there was kind of this interesting conversation that popped up around COVID of, how well optimized are scientific systems? Can we be doing even better? While at the same time recognizing how important a lot of the basic science investments have been for delivering the foundations of things like the mRNA vaccines. One of the things that's especially exciting to me is the fact that there seem to be parallel efforts on metascience happening across different layers of society. So a lot of private funders right now are launching new scientific labs. Just to spotlight a couple, there's the ARC Institute based in California, which is really betting on this funding people rather than projects idea. They're giving sort of really large, ambitious budgets with a 7-year time frame to kind of really promising and ambitious scientists. And we're kind of seeing the results of that already. They have this really exciting EVO model, which is sort of a new LLM for predicting a whole range of sort of DNA type data, which was exciting. There's also Arcadia Science, which is really, I think their focus is on pioneering open source scientific infrastructure, and in particular around animal models and whether, things beyond rats may actually be useful. On the philanthropic side, there's been a host of interest around things like focused research organizations, which is sort of I might describe as trying to take the basic model of sort of a concentrated push with a flexible organizational structure, kind of like the Human Genome Project, but trying to operationalize that and repeat it across a lot of different dimensions. The Simons Institute has the Pivot Fellowship, which I'm excited about as a way of sort of helping researchers go from one discipline to another. The Sloan Foundation funded this really exciting Management and Scientific Labs survey, which is for the first time actually trying to collect data on how much do we see the management structures across different biomedical labs actually vary, and what can that tell us about scientific productivity happening at those labs? And then on the governmental side, I'm going to talk a little bit about this NSF Metascience partnership, which I think is really exciting, but there's also other things happening. The US Patent and Trademark Office, not necessarily what people would maybe immediately think of when they think of metascience, but they actually did a proper randomized control trial around different ways of shrinking the gender patenting gap. And they found that application assistance actually made a really meaningful difference. And they're both scaling up the application assistance pilot program, but they're also scaling up sort of an R&D unit internally, which can sort of do more of these process improvement RCTs on an ongoing basis, which is exciting. And then just last week, the NIH actually announced an exciting research opportunity where basically they're doing a call for research partnerships where researchers can reach out to them and potentially they can have sort of a ongoing conversation about getting access to NIH data so that they can then do sort of more meaningful experiments in partnership with the NIH. So that's great as well. And I want to call out specifically why I'm so excited about federal government involvement in this, and maybe especially US federal government involvement. I think in a lot of previous eras, when there's been excitement around things like metascience, we've been stymied by basically a lack of sample size. To really actually meaningfully provide a power calculation about, what size of a sample do you need to sort of statistically prove an effect in one direction or the other, you need really, really, really large grant sizes. And a lot of private foundations who I think are excited and interested in a lot of these areas don't actually have the internal sort of sample size internally to be able to drive those changes. And so federal government investment is, I think, especially relevant here. And on the flip side of that, I think it's actually really important that we think about how to carefully measure counterfactual impact. One case study I think is illustrative here is a couple of years ago, New Zealand was excited about the idea of doing a research lottery, which was, I think, an exciting, bold, ambitious idea. And they did it, which is another sort of exciting thing. Sometimes these ideas die in the ideation stage. But I think it was a missed opportunity that there wasn't as much on maybe the program evaluation side as I would have liked to see. My understanding, the extent of kind of the evaluation after the fact was to send out a survey to all the various researchers and effectively get their opinion on how did they like using the lottery. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the researchers who won the lottery liked using the lottery more than the researchers that didn't win the lottery. And so I would have really liked to have seen kind of a more carefully designed evaluation in the beginning of that to make sure we can actually have meaningful information going forward about what's the impact of a research lottery. So just to highlight maybe a couple of the different infrastructure layers that are happening now that I think is enabling some of this metascience interest. We've collaborated with some of our friends at the Federation of American Scientists to launch the Metascience Working Group, which is basically just a small space where different folks across the US federal government can share best practices, lessons learned, and kind of ideate on different sorts of experiments or process improvements, not just on the idea side, but also on the best practices side. How do you actually embed the expertise to be able to do some of these power calculations, for instance, or how can you use other transactions agreement as like a contracting authority to actually structure some of these data use agreements? So there's a lot of really practical, I think, questions about how to structure these things, and we're trying to provide a space for some of those conversations to happen. Our colleagues at JPAL have also launched, I think, last year, the Science for Progress Initiative, which is a re-granting fund for academics who can find partnerships to work with the federal government, because oftentimes, as soon as you start introducing grants on the federal side, it can really complicate things. And so having, I think, outside philanthropic support for some of these research partnerships can also be especially useful. And then I'll talk a little bit about this NSF partnership. I guess first to preview, I think one of the precipitating events for this NSF partnership was a similar study group on regional innovation that happened between 2022 and 2023. Basically, as many of you, I'm sure, know, the NSF, especially the new TIP directorate, one of the first big initiatives they've been doing is on the idea of place-based innovation. But there have been obviously a lot of previous attempts to do place-based innovation. And I think much to their credit, the NSF was really interested in deeply engaging with that literature. And so they brought in a lot of top academics, including Jorge Guzman from Columbia, Scott Stern at MIT, and my frequent collaborator, Heidi Williams, who's now at Dartmouth, to basically kind of do a guided discussion and study group between top NSF staff, and academics who had actually been engaging with this literature to make sure that as NSF was thinking about how to carefully measure the impact of these place-based investments, that they were sort of not starting from scratch or reinventing the wheel, but instead learning from a lot of these kind of best practices that had come before. And that actually resulted in this really great paper, which I'm sure if you just Google Scott Stern place-based innovation, it should come up. It's on the NBER website, or there's a hyperlink if the slides are going around later. But I think that model ended up being really illustrative. I think NSF liked the opportunity to kind of have off the record, behind the scenes conversations with real academic experts who have that kind of expertise to make sure that their investments are doing kind of what they want, and that you can think about the evaluation side of this really carefully. So inspired by that model, I think last year the NSF reached out to us to see if we could convene a similar kind of study group for some of these larger meta-science efforts. And that was kind of the basis of the partnership that we have with them now. Small nerdy side note, but this was actually enabled by Other Transaction Authority, which is a much more flexible contracting authority that NSF just got access to through the CHIPS and Science Act. And so kind of a nice case study itself for giving more flexible contracting mechanisms can actually enable research collaborations down the road. We came in not with sort of a pre-existing agenda of what we wanted to cover, but instead we wanted the list really be driven by NSF program officers and kind of their pre-existing knowledge on the ground. They have so much local knowledge about where are the real bottlenecks in the process. And so rather than saying, you know, hey, we're coming in from the outside, we've got all these ideas, instead we wanted to be really driven by them and kind of their insights. And I guess the fundamental thing we are providing is research support, data analysis, and kind of experimental design expertise. Oftentimes it's hard to really dedicate real resources for this unless you have a specific line item from Congress for these kinds of resources. And Congress is frequently hesitant to provide that kind of stuff. And so we can sort of help provide some of that expertise from the outside. But I think in the long run, it would be really great for a lot of this expertise to be embedded in-house. And that's why I'm excited to see things like the UK Metascience Unit, and hopefully the US can follow suit. I guess one other caveat, these are not disclosures, what I'm going to share here from discussions with NSF staff. That's all kind of covered under the partnership as being confidential, but I wanted to share some of the ways we have been presenting information to NSF and instead kind of my own insights kind of into the process. And we've been really thinking about this as kind of 3 different modes of doing meta-science at different levels of kind of maybe administrative complexity. The first is you can just look at the historical administrative data. There's lots and lots and lots of, I think, natural experiments that have happened over the years. Just to highlight one quick example, for kind of unrelated reasons, a number of directorates within the National Science Foundation switched away from their traditional deadlines policy to a no deadlines policy. And the NSF actually highlighted this in their learning agenda as one of the research questions that they were particularly interested in. How did that change the kinds of applications that were submitted in the first place, the number and the quality of applications? Because there's sort of natural variation across the different NSF directorates, we don't even have to run any experiments. We can just look through the historical administrative data and kind of see what we can suss out there. Maybe the second category is what my colleague Ben Jones would call diagnostic experiments. These are basically very low lift ways of generating information about what the counterfactual impact of a new pilot program would be without actually having to run the pilot. So to give one example, the NIH actually has the ability to desk reject somewhere between like 40% of applications that come in if they know that they're not going to be competitive. The NSF does not currently do desk reject policies for the most part. And so one kind of question that I think has come up frequently is, well, what would happen if the NSF allowed program officers to desk reject proposals that they thought were not going to be competitive? One way of actually generating information on this without actually doing a desk reject would be to just have a population of either current or former NSF program officers kind of go through a current funding round and basically say, if you were scoring these proposals, which ones would you have desk reject or not? And then you can compare and see, okay, which ones actually went through the peer review gauntlet and kind of what are the differences between those populations? Do we see that the ones that would have been desk rejected are actually the ones that were sort of deemed not competitive through the traditional peer review process or not? Just by asking questions and having both groups of reviewers or groups of sort of program officers at NSF kind of rescore applications or add additional questions to the end of reviewer forms, we can generate a lot of information that can be used to run simulations about what would be the effect of if we were to do it. And that's kind of like a low cost way of running a bunch of diagnostic experiments that can then inform your kind of actual investments you want to make when you actually decide to run pilot programs. Because if it turns out that, NSF peer review or NSF program officers would be desk rejecting a lot of proposals that do ultimately get funded. That can kind of inform whether or not that's the most high value kind of experiment to actually run. And then there's the third, I think maybe the most straightforward, is actually running pilot programs where you try to carefully build in counterfactual sort of evaluation into the very process itself. One thing maybe I'd want to highlight as a difference between what are proposals that make sense on the diagnostic level and what are ones that you maybe want to prioritize actually running in the real world are interventions where you expect a larger share of the effect or the treatment effect in some sense to come on the application side rather than on the reviewer side. If all you're doing, and let's maybe run through the idea of golden tickets as just an example. So this is an idea that the NSF director has sort of on the record in a couple of interviews been very excited about. The basic idea is that there are concerns the current NSF peer review process is perhaps too consensus oriented. And if the things that sort of come out of a peer review process are just the lowest common denominator, the ones that make the fewest people upset, then maybe you're not actually funding the high risk, high reward proposals. And so one way that you could try to address that would be to add a certain number of golden tickets, or sometimes also called priority flags, where basically individual reviewers could champion a specific proposal that they're excited about and kind of make sure that that advances into the final round, or in some sense act as like an anti-veto. If you think that the primary impact of that is on the reviewer side, then you could actually just add that as kind of like a diagnostic experiment. Ask reviewers, if you had a golden ticket, which ones would you have given it to and why? But it might also be the case that adding golden tickets sort of changes the kinds of applications that are submitted in the first place. When people know that they're going to be judged by a different set of metrics, you might change the kinds of applications you submit. I think it's important to point out that a diagnostic experiment cannot measure that effect. To measure that effect, you actually have to do a golden ticket or a priority flag experiment in the real world to generate that information. And so I think that's one way of kind of prioritizing which ones do you do as diagnostic experiments first versus which ones do you actually want to run, is to what extent do you expect the effect size to come on the re-ranking applications within the existing pool versus generating new applications into the pool. Just some final sort of maybe caveats and opportunities that I think are actually exciting about these larger conversations. I think these questions work quite well for maybe plumbing or operational improvement kind of things, and they work less well for existential questions of should this entire program exist or not. Those questions generate a lot of pushback. You have to have much larger, I think, well-structured RCTs to do it. But trying to find small operational efficiency improvements can be done on a really small scale, kind of low cost way that I think really does not engender political backlash, but can nonetheless drive really important long run improvements. And maybe the second point here, and this should be obvious, I think, to a lot of people here, is that there are not universally validated metrics of what we mean by scientific progress. Instead, we're dealing with a lot of sort of loose proxies, and a lot of the information we care about is really context dependent. But I think one important consideration is that we don't have to sort of wait for the 10 years down the line. Did this actually fund more Nobel Prizes than we would have otherwise funded? That's a very existential question. It takes a long time to generate that information. Questions that are especially I think shorter are things like, if one of our goals as a political system is to make sure we're funding a cohort of younger scientists, that is something you can measure right off the bat. Or there are some interesting sort of proxy measures for scientific novelty. I think there's some interesting applications where basically people use natural language process applications on grant reviews or grant proposals, and you see to what extent are they combining novel technical keywords that have not been combined before, and that seems to be a at least decent proxy for how inventive or novel is the proposal. And so you could look at some of those proxy measures and a lot of these summary statistics, and that's not perfect, but I think it can at least generate information, especially when we already know that there are political goals that we have to fund, say, younger or more diverse researchers. So in terms of next steps, yeah, we're currently kind of in discussions with NSF about the bottlenecks, ideas, and priorities that they have. We're scoping out potential pilot programs, kind of thinking through on the maybe power calculation side. If you wanted to test for this kind of hypothesis, how large would your sample size need to be? How many different kinds of NSF directorates would we need to pull in for an experiment like that? But ultimately, NSF is going to make the decisions about what actually happens in terms of the diagnostic versus the pilot versus the kind of retrospective data level. But I've been just so encouraged and enthusiastic about the NSF leadership. I think they have a real heart and mind, I think, for this. And they were in many ways the ones who kind of like sought out and started this partnership. And so I think it's a real testament to the NSF leadership we have currently that they're really trying to take Metascience seriously. And maybe kind of one final note just before we go into the discussion is that I suspect there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration, both with the larger international scientific community, on the governmental, and on the philanthropic side. One point to kind of echo back to the sample size consideration I mentioned before, I think it would actually be really great if at the same time NSF was trying some either new diagnostic or actual pilot program, if other countries wanted to sort of mirror that same methodology, you would effectively be increasing your real sample size and kind of providing maybe a institutional robustness check. If, for instance, you were doing a pilot program on desk rejects or on golden tickets, and you found the same effect size both in the US context and in the UK context, I think that would increase your sort of sense that this is actually a real effect that we're identifying. And so I hope that there are a lot of ways that we can collaborate kind of to make sure that we're expanding our sample size, getting more kind of institutional validation across different scientific contexts. But in the interest of time, I will end there. There's my contact information in case anyone wants to reach out.